I'm going to offer, I guess, a more retrospective and holistic interpretation of what I sort of think is at work in some of the Myriad decisions, especially if you contrast it with the other sort of trial of the century in gene patenting, which is Diamond v. Chakrabarty, which was decided in 1980. And the interesting thing about that case is that if you look at the amicus curiae briefs that were filed, for starters, there weren't nearly as many of them as were involved in Myriad, but also, with the exception of the People's Business Commission or Corporation, all of them favor the idea of patenting genetically modified bacteria, as opposed to, if you look at the Myriad case, which we just decided, there's a much more even split of opinion among both academic organizations, depending on what type of biotech company you see, and I'm really interested in that sort of divided opinion. The other thing I should say in an interpretive sense is that approaching the history of legal history, I'm sort of taking the approach of asking what's sort of the climate of opinion, what's the public culture that surrounds Supreme Court decisions, and this is sort of you can look at court decisions as being questions of applying doctrine, but honestly, as Robert sort of alluded to, once it gets up to the Supreme Court, a lot of things can happen, and what happens, only has a loose connection to precedent. And so I'm really interested in sort of probing the deeper sort of transformations in the culture of what gene patents mean. And so I'm just going to outline a few ideas that I think have been important between basically 1980 and 2009 in shaping that discourse. And of course, this is slightly reflexive because people like Robert have been very active agents in these discussions. So there's a slight snake eating its tail moment to the round table. So the main thing that I want to flag is that there's a very different vision of what innovative role gene patents could have. If you look at the Diamond v. Chakrabarty discussion and the Bay-Dole Act, which was passed in 1980 in the same year, they're citing a number of documents, but they imputed this idea that in order to have the translation of discoveries into therapeutically useful products, patents are essential. And this is a lot, and this many amicus curiae briefs take, and it's this idea that that's only by cultivating a market for therapeutics will biological research essentially find a useful application. And that changes dramatically in the case of Myriad. You still have a number of biotech companies, of course, making that same argument, but you also have a much larger group of patients' advocacy groups, scientists, and also biotech companies arguing that at least patenting naturally occurring genes will be bad for innovation and bad for commercial growth. And I think that one of the starting points for this type of argument is this article by Michael Heller and Rebecca Eisenberg, which appears in Science in 1998, which introduces the idea that patenting in biomedical research can create an anti-commons, which is to say, it's like sealing off an area that should be of freely accessible knowledge and keeping it out of the innovative process. This, of course, coincides with sort of the peak of the Human Genome Project, where there's, and people have talked about how is the Human Genome Project really sort of publicly accessible survey science, or is this sort of a retrospective loss? What I want to highlight is that by the mid-90s, the Human Genome Project has really put the idea of open sort of genetic information into sort of the discussion of science and science policy and the identity of scientific work in a way that didn't exist in the same way in 1980. And I think that that's sort of one of the first major transitions. You have the Human Genome Project, you have this focus on openness. The second major thing sort of follows in the wake of the Human Genome Project in the last 15 years, which is you have the incredible rise in parts of the biotech industry which are centered on the use of genetic information as a diagnostic tool. You have this idea that through offering diagnostic services, I think Adele Clark in her idea of biomedicalization talks about selling products that you can use to minimize or manage risk. Simply giving somebody information as opposed to therapy has many potential commercial applications. And that's an industry you see groups like Gene Formatic and Gene DX filing amicus curiae briefs. This is also a line that comes up in congressional hearings from the mid-2000s saying, look, there's actually this whole other type of commercial sector that can be founded as long as we have a commons of information. And The third sort of major change is one that Robert also just alluded to, which is the idea that especially the type of information that's being given is diagnostic information, which can go to patients as opposed to therapeutically useful information. And that the AMA sort of argues is that, like, look, we don't know what we're going to be able to find in these gene tests. The Lander brief that you mentioned, gene testing is getting, genomic sequencing is getting that much cheaper, and the idea is this needs to be almost refashioned as a commons that sort of patients can draw from, that various innovative companies can draw from. So all of these are, I think, sort of new arguments and new ways of thinking about genes and commercialization that have emerged since time v. Chakrabarty, and they have significant effects. I mean, it matters, for example, that the U.S. government, in its amicus curiae brief to the court, doesn't decide to support the idea that these genes should be patented. That's like a huge transition, and it's something that the court notes in its final opinion. And so I think I'm going to wrap up there, but it's just this idea that, you can look narrowly at what the court does and rules, but there's also this much larger climate of scientific and public opinion, which does have bearing on what the court does, and that opinion, especially, in the last 30, especially in the last 20 years, has shifted decisively towards this idea of having sort of an informational genetic commons that can be freely drawn upon, as opposed to the older sort of like early biotech industry vision of the need to promote sort of strong intellectual property for the sake of therapeutic translation.